Yeah, it's so misused. It's so people assume any sort of medical information whatsoever, like, oh, you can't have that because of HIPAA.
I really liked the piece that you wrote about testing and tracing in the workplace when we're talking about COVID, and I thought it was so useful.
Oh, thanks.
You sort of start off from this premise that it might make sense for employers to do some testing and tracing in the workplace. Can you say more about why you think that is important?
Well, yeah, I think it's important just so people know kind of the extent to which the disease has spread, because there's so many asymptomatic people that it's important to know who has the disease and therefore have them limit their spread. And if you look at other countries, they've been much more kind of aggressive about implementing nationwide government mandated testing, tracing, and isolation.
It does sound like sort of the usual story of employers ending up having to fill a gap where the government services don't quite get you there.
Exactly. So they can kind of take care of their workforce on some level, and obviously that has an effect on, if it's a retail in-person industry, it has effect on their customer base. The more interaction your workforce has with other people, the more of a public role you're playing by kind of monitoring that workforce.
That's a really good point. So can you talk a little bit about what the rules are in the workplace when it comes to employee testing?
Sure. So the big statute that would apply here is the Americans with Disabilities Act. Okay. And it applies to medical testing. Pretty early on, the EEOC came out with guidance saying if you want to test your employees for the coronavirus, either through a temperature check or through actual testing, that is permitted under the ADA because of the direct threat standard. If the employee would pose a direct threat to other employees or members of the public, then the employer is justified in conducting a test, requiring them to have a test, that sort of thing.
Okay, so the idea is like you check their temperature in the morning, I guess, when they arrive at work.
A lot of employers have employees do that kind of on their own, right? You have to send in a little, web page form that you filled out saying, yes, I've checked my temperature. Or, some workplaces have, someone standing at the front door before you go in and you have to have your temperature checked.
What happens after that? Like, what if someone turns out to have an elevated temperature?
I think the best practice in this area is that you're supposed to tell the worker to get out of line basically and go home. And then depending on what happens, if they get a diagnosis one way or the other, obviously then they follow up on that. But from what I've seen is you want to kind of maintain the anonymity on some level. Sometimes they'll have a line where it's kind of covered and you can kind of make one or another choice. And so, it's a little more kind of hidden whether you have a higher temperature or not. Yeah.
It is kind of a lot of situations where there are privacy interests, but everyone knows what's going on. It's like, oh, we're doing an investigation. We can't tell you who's involved, but everybody knows anyways.
Right. I mean, it comes up with contact tracing and disclosure as well, right? How anonymous are you really when, you only had contact with one person at the store and they're like, well, you may have come with contact with one of our employees, okay, I guess it was that guy that I saw when I came in, right?
So this is the thing that you always hear from, I guess, non-experts is like, oh, we can't do this or that because of HIPAA. Can you explain for us when we should actually be concerned about HIPAA versus all the other times where people just sort of mention HIPAA as a thing?
Yeah, it's so misused. It's so people assume any sort of medical information whatsoever, like, oh, you can't have that because of HIPAA, or I can't tell you that because of HIPAA. Of course, my favorite was the early pandemic, cards that people had where I do not have to wear a mask and I can't tell you why because of HIPAA. Right? Completely ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense. HIPAA applies to basically medical institutions. So, medical care providers, health insurance providers, clearinghouses for medical information. But, if it's health information, but it's related to employment, that's not covered by HIPAA. The one thing that is a little tricky in this area is if you get tested by an outside provider, right? But if the employee voluntarily discloses it, then that's perfectly fine.
Okay, let's talk about contact tracing. I'm interested in hearing about like some of the technology that could be used or is used.
Well, I mean, employers have had a lot of experience, as you know, with GPS mechanisms already for a lot of different discrete types of, professions or occupations. So, truck drivers, obviously, GPS, very involved in what they do and really kind of monitor, like, does it look like the driver's falling asleep or, various, it's not just like where they're located, it's, how they're interacting with the vehicle, what their speeds are, very complicated. Warehouse workers, right? Efforts to kind of tell them exactly, are you taking too long in this particular area of the warehouse? Hotel housekeeping as well, right? The amount of time is spent in any particular room, where in the room, what's going on. You're spending too long to clean the bathroom, And particularly if you have employees that all have these devices, then the proximity to other devices can be monitored.
What do you think will be the lasting impact of all of this on the workplace?
I do worry that the ramifications of this will be that your health information will be much more kind of available to your employer, and your location data will be much more available to your employer. And a lot of those things that are set up as, and we might not have like a clear end to this pandemic, right? Because even when the vaccine comes out, it'll still kind of come out in stages, right? So there won't be like a clear moment we can be like, okay, we're back to normal, right? And we're just going to throw out all that stuff that we did when we had the pandemic going on.
Is that troubling to you?
What's troubling to me is that people feel so disconnected from it, right? We have these kind of employers and managers that are making these decisions, and employees just kind of have to lump it, right? I would much prefer to see some efforts to bring employees in, and this can happen in unionized workplaces, right? But bring employees into the conversation and say, okay, well, what makes sense? How can we frame this so that it is protecting your privacy to the extent we can, while at the same time making sure this information about the spread of this, pandemic is available so that we're as protected as we can be.